Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Weisberger, CEO of CoinRoutes. It is August 4th, 2023, time for our This Week in Crypto Roundup, and the markets are still pretty dull. Dog days of summer continue. Bitcoin, as I do this, is fallen a little bit below 29,000, down about 1%. Ether's down a couple of percent. The altcoins are a little bit squishier. They're down between 5 and 9%, with things like Aave on the DeFi side, for some of the stories I'll talk about in a bit, down around 12% or so. This is in a backdrop of NASDAQ and other markets down between 2 and 3% on the equity side. So kind of a squishy, kind of drifting down kind of week. But when it comes to the news stories, all I could say is crazy is in the air. So we have 8 stories we're going to talk about today. And we'll start first with the SEC suing Richard Hart, him of the Hexian fame, of the Hex and Pulse chain fame. And it's amusing because the first thing that everyone focused on in the lawsuit is using proceeds of the sale of Hex to buy a rare black diamond, which might have been, if you believe some people, coming from outer space. You can't make this stuff up. Now, the reality is, what's really particularly funny about this story is that the Hexians' defense, I actually sat in on a podcast and listened to on Crypto Town Hall, a defense. They talk about Richard Hart as some sort of new age crypto messiah and claim that he wasn't asking them to buy or to fund his activities, but actually to make sacrifices or a sacrifice. I mean, honestly, if paying money is become the modern age equivalent of sacrificing a goat as a burnt offering, I guess I really don't know what to make about that. I don't think the SEC does either. But the core of the case really is about misappropriation of client funds. So we'll see what happens with all of this. But it's an interesting story and yet another way for them to try to claim jurisdiction as Hex is a security. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the context of another case. But the second story this week, and once again, can't make this up, is a $68 million rug pull on a token called Bald, which was supposedly in honor of Brian Armstrong's bald head. Brian Armstrong being the CEO of Coinbase, who is leading the industry's efforts for regulatory clarity and had very good earnings today or yesterday, kind of confounding Wall Street analysts. But what makes this story even crazier is there are supposed sleuths tying this rug pull to Sam Bankman-Fried, sitting in his parents' basement, supposedly limited to a flip phone. Now, obviously his parents have internet, so who knows if it's possible. Hell, I wouldn't put anything past this guy. He pulled off one of the most audacious cons in the history of finance, if not the most audacious. So him doing a small rug pull, I guess he has to do something to pass the time. But in all seriousness, there's no good data on this. The fact that there's a rug pull, the only point that I want to make on all this is it is yet another example of why we need reasonable regulations, that people, when they list tokens, have to disclose the tokenomics and have to identify themselves when they list the tokens. And when they do, if they lie about it, they can be prosecuted. And if there's a market mechanism that can be manipulated, that can be prosecuted. Basically, we need simple rules. And the rules have to work for crypto, which of course current rules don't. So there is that. Third case, third piece of news. Once again, the Crocodile of Wall Street and her husband finally plead guilty to the world's largest hack. So they stole, and I think they were accused of stealing last year, 120,000 Bitcoin from Bitfinex. But what this case proved is they were forced to plead guilty because the evidence against them was overwhelming. Without regard to the nonsense of the Crocodile of Wall Street or Razzlecon the Rapper or any of the other nonsense around this case, the simple fact is Bitcoin is a lousy way to try to steal money at scale. It just stinks because if you use it at scale, you can be caught. And that is what happens. It happens almost every time. And it's something that criminals understand, the FBI understands, but yet the fudsters don't seem to want to admit it. Yet again, more evidence for that. I'll point it out every time it comes up. The fourth story this week that's interesting is Bloomberg's resident skeptical analysts, and I've talked with them on both Eric and James on Crypto Town Hall before, have upped their view. They now believe that the odds of a Bitcoin spot ETF being approved are up to as much as 65%, or if you give it an extra whole year, 80%. Now, what's changed their minds? Well, the honest truth is, it's what I've been saying. The SEC can rationally claim a win if they approve these ETFs soon. They can claim that they've gotten jurisdiction over at least some aspect of trading Bitcoin, which they clearly don't have any other way to get because Bitcoin is a commodity. So I expect them to claim that. I don't think any of their denial reasons are accurate anymore. In fact, they've never really been all that accurate. And they've been approving futures ETFs left and right, including, as I said last week, a leveraged ETF. But keep in mind, the futures ETFs have underperformed spot by 30%. Now they're talking about approving futures Ether ETFs. Ether will perform even worse because Ether spot could be staked for a yield. And so Ether ETFs that can use staking will clearly outperform by enormous amounts. And the SEC will be on the hook for approving inferior products. Probably not a good look for them with all the losses they've been racking up in court these days. The fifth story is one that I find extremely hard to believe, but it's that the DOJ is worried about introducing criminal indictments against Binance for money laundering or whatever they're going to indict them for, because they're afraid of a run on the bank and hurting investors with Binance. Well, it's an interesting theory, and in fact would be kind of strange. In fact, if anything, ironic that the DOJ would care more about harming investors than the SEC, which is supposedly basically their core mission is to protect investors. But leaving that aside, people have said, well, the only reason they could be worried, there must be something really horrible going on there because Binance says they're fully backed. And if there was a bank run, it wouldn't matter and no one would lose any money. But people have to remember Binance is both a spot exchange and a derivative exchange. And on the derivative exchange, according to the most recent figures I saw, they have over $10 billion of open interest on leveraged contracts. So if they were to be sued, and if that were to trigger a market liquidation on any tokens, then effectively there's the risk that their insurance fund would be unable to meet that if all of those coins, all of those positions had to be forced liquidated. That's the fear. And that has nothing to do with not backing reserves. That just has everything to do with risk in the system that is inherent to a derivative exchange. But as I said, I don't really believe it. The sixth story is also really instructive and makes my traditional financial genes or background kind of want to laugh. And that is there was an exploit in the Curve, the CRV token and chain and DeFi protocol, and what it exposed is a massive liability. So evidently, the founder of Curve, who owns 48%, 47% of the tokens, put a lot of those tokens on DeFi protocols and took out loans against it to finance whatever he wanted to finance, either to invest or finance lifestyle. I don't know. I don't care. But those platforms that got through all of 2022 unscathed by being 150% margined, unfortunately forgot something, which is 150% margin is only useful if when you sell the collateral, it doesn't drop more than 50%. But the problem with CRV is it's extremely illiquid. So when this came out, I did a very quick analysis using CoinRoute software. The first thing I found out was I checked. And if you sold $10 million worth of CRV, you literally could have driven the price down 57%. That's 10 million. And this was a much larger loan set than that. In fact, at 100 million, it dropped it down 60%. But the reason for it being such a small difference is that obviously large, we'll call it stabilizing bids were put into the system. People are willing to stand there and buy some in order to stop the whole thing from imploding. Now, if you contrast that with Ethereum, for example, Ethereum, if you sold $10 million, you'd knock it down less than somewhere around 0.5%, give or take. And if you sold $100 million, you'd knock it down a few percent, I think like 8 or 9%, depending on market conditions. But that's a far cry from causing a problem. And if you're 150% collateralized, it would never be an issue. So the truth is that DeFi protocols need to take liquidity into account. Now, I believe they will do so. I think you will start to see that evolve very quickly, that taking data that's publicly available to score liquidity for a token, you should be able to haircut it. Something as CRV should probably have about a 90% haircut, at least 80%. And if you do that, then with your 150% margining, you would literally have to put in, $300 or $500 million to take $100 million loan. At that price or that amount of liquidity, it shouldn't be a problem. But we'll see how it all works out as these things get developed. But it's clearly a lesson that needs to be learned in the DeFi community. So we'll get to the last two cases, which are actual cases or about in court and that sort of thing. And they both have to do with the ongoing saga of what is a security and the SEC's regulation by enforcement. So the first, I think I talked about this toward the end of last week, but it's gotten a lot of press, is Judge Rakoff in the Do Kwon litigation basically disagreed with Judge Torres, specifically in the context of the Do Kwon case, saying that securities transactions in tokens that enrich the founders directly, regardless of whether they're on exchange or off exchange, should be considered securities transactions, at least insofar as the SEC in the context of a fraud case. I'm sort of sympathetic to that. I think fraud should be prosecutable as fraud regardless. And whether or not it's a civil idea from the SEC or criminal from the DOJ, I think it should be allowed to proceed in most circumstances. At least some regulators should have jurisdiction. But what's amazing about this is how people have jumped upon this to say, oh, well, this proves that Torres was wrong in the Ripple case, in the XRP case. And I don't think that's true at all. I mean, first of all, there are very different facts and circumstances. The facts are different because this is a fraud case and there was no allegation of investor harm whatsoever in the Ripple case. And that is a massively important difference. And the second thing was the circumstances. He wanted to allow the prosecution to move forward. In the Ripple case, we were getting close to findings of what would be on trial. And it was after 2.5 years. This is in the beginning of that case. It was less than 2 months from the SEC filing it. So at very different points in the case, whether or not it should go forward. But the second thing is there is zero mention in Rakoff's decision, not that he even have standing to talk about it, that would talk about the culpability of the exchanges themselves listing the Luna or UST tokens. Now, UST, because it was potentially promising a yield under Anchor Protocol, is different. But XRP never promised a yield to anybody. And so it is a very different set of facts and circumstances. The one thing that everyone agrees on, though, is something simple. Matt Levine summed it up really well. One, if you fund your enterprise by selling assets to named individuals or investors, you are probably going to be considered an investment contract by doing so. And two, on the other extreme, if it's trading, if something that is clearly a commodity that has no ties to the efforts of individuals or a corporation that are trading as a commodity with a use case on an exchange, it's simply not a security, it's a commodity. And those are different jurisdictions. Those are pretty much widely agreed. The only real question is, in the Ripple case, should Ripple Labs have been somewhat liable for their programmatic sales on exchanges? Not the exchanges liable for trading it, but Ripple Labs liable for their selling it that way. That's the only thing that's calling into question. And that, I don't believe, is anything near broad enough for the SEC to want to appeal, but we'll see. I think the SEC is going to want that, in the words of a famous poem, to go gently into that good night. But the ultimate gently into that good night is our last story of the week, which is Coinbase, who filed to dismiss the charges. Now, they did a few things in this brief that go beyond what we talked about a few weeks ago. Today, they specifically cited the fact that the filing of the SEC violated their due process rights. And now that is something that they're obviously setting up for a Supreme Court challenge to probably win at the Supreme Court. They also specifically talked about how the SEC violated their own earlier testimony and congressional actions and testimony. And we talked about that chapter and verse last week. And so they are invoking the major question doctrine. So it seems pretty clear Coinbase is setting themselves up to win if it gets to the nation's highest court. And I don't think very many people think that that won't happen. So the sole question here is, will the circuit courts, or the courts that this is being applied to, will they grant the motion, or will the SEC in fact let the motion win because they don't want to be embroiled in this at taxpayer expense, where if they lose completely. In fact, what I think a lot of people are hoping for is this will all be rendered moot by congressional action. But, honestly, without an administration change or more votes on the Democratic side switching, that seems unlikely. In any event, the tides are definitely changing. I think the amount of crazy in the air these days, it just feels like something is up. And we'll see what happens as we go into the fall. But I have a sneaking suspicion that the current current lack of volatility is going to come to an end. I think interest is peaking up, and we'll see what happens. But it's still August. We got a long way to go before people get back from vacation. Most of Europe is out, and Europe is where a lot of the action is. So I guess we'll see in a few weeks. In any case, have a great weekend, everybody, and stay safe out there.